In the first and fifth episodes of Look a Little Closer, we looked at the fact that the Bible presents Jesus and Paul as being Jewish teachers who faithfully kept and taught the Torah. This is in contrast to how Jesus and Paul are usually viewed. Usually Jesus, and especially Paul, are viewed as those who taught that the Torah was abolished, or at the very least, no longer relevant for righteous living. Some Christians might concede that while among Jewish people the apostles continued to keep the Torah and practice Judaism, but this was simply to act as a witness to them, to hopefully win them over for Christ. Their Torah observance was certainly not because that's what God expected of them. One passage usually used to prove this is 1 Corinthians 9 verses 20 to 22. There Paul said, "To the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might win Jews. To those under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some." But did Paul really view being Jewish and keeping Torah as simply something that was relative to the situation he found himself in, depending on the people who were around? Is there perhaps a better way to understand this passage, one that is consistent with the picture of Paul that we get in the book of Acts? To find out, let's look a little closer. The book of Acts depicts Paul as faithfully going to synagogue on the Sabbath, traveling to Jerusalem for the festivals, and undergoing ritual purification for purposes of presenting offerings in the temple. In other words, the book of Acts depicts Paul as a Torah-observant Pharisee. James said in Acts 21 verse 24 that there were nothing to the rumors about Paul, but that he himself walked orderly, keeping the Torah. And Paul himself testified in his various trials in the book of Acts that he was a Pharisee, educated under Gamaliel, and that he served God, believing everything that is in accordance with Torah and the prophets. If this is the picture of Paul that we get in the book of Acts with regard to his relationship to the Torah, then we should keep in mind that it is this same Torah-observant Jew who is writing in 1 Corinthians 9. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul taught that if you engage in something that is generally permissible, but causes a brother to stumble, then you should abstain from that action. Put simply, we shouldn't be looking to live self-indulgent lives, but we should keep others in mind when we live out our freedom. To further illustrate this, Paul then, in chapter 9, brought up the point that, as an apostle, he has the right to benefit from the work of his ministry. He said in verse 7, "Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Or who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock?" In verse 9, he also appealed to the Torah commandment that you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and applied it to human workers. Specifically saying in verse 11, "If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you?" However, after making the case that he should be paid for his work of ministry, Paul said that he took a different path. In verse 12 he said, "Nevertheless, we do not use this right, but we endure all things so that we cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ." It's easy for some to view people in ministry as those who are simply out for money. So Paul decided to forfeit the right to get paid for his ministry, and as verse 18 implies, he instead took pride in the fact that he proclaimed the gospel without charge. In verse 19, Paul summarized the preceding verses by saying, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more." So, in the following verses, Paul went on to explain how he forfeited his freedoms with certain groups, for the end goal of hopefully winning people over to the gospel, and his way of understanding things in general. While there are several ways we can break down verses 20 to 22, it's most likely that Paul is speaking of two groups, Jews and Gentiles. Paul said in verse 20, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law." To the Jews Paul became as a Jew? What did he mean? Wasn't Paul Jewish? A Torah-observant Pharisee at that? What Paul meant was further clarified in the rest of the verse when he said, to those who are under the law as under the law. But again, wasn't Paul Torah observant? Yes, but in Paul's letters, the phrase under the law generally has a negative connotation. It usually refers to being under the Torah's condemnation or penalty. And it especially refers to those who rely on their legal Jewish status for salvation. So Paul is specifically referring to Jewish people who had not yet recognized Jesus as the Messiah for salvation, but instead relied on being Jewish for salvation. Paul clarified that he became as a Jew under the law so that he might win those who were under the law, even though he himself was not under the law. This really does sound like Paul only pretended to be a Torah-observant Jew for the sake of evangelizing the Jewish people. But that wouldn't be consistent with the description of Paul as a Torah-observant apostle of Jesus we find in the book of Acts. So it makes more sense to understand that Paul meant that while he himself wasn't a Jew who relied on being Jewish for salvation, he still submitted to the larger Jewish community so he could remain a witness of Messiah within it. How do we know this? Well, in 2 Corinthians 11:24, Paul told us that 5 times he received from the Jews 39 lashes. In Paul's day, a Jewish man, if found guilty of certain crimes in a Jewish court, could receive 39 lashes as punishment. Paul not only submitted to this once, but 5 times. It's likely that Paul had not even committed anything sinful, but instead was likely punished for his association with Gentiles who were no doubt viewed by the larger Jewish community as idolaters. So in reality, Paul could have left the larger Jewish community and only associated with Jewish and Gentile believers, but for the sake of exposing the larger Jewish community to the gospel, Paul gave up this freedom. Paul went on to say in verse 21, to those who are without law, as without law. Who are those without law? From a first century Jewish perspective, those without law are Gentiles, or more specifically, pagans. Is Paul saying that when he was around pagans, he lived as a pagan? No, he clarifies that he is not referring to pagan Gentiles, but rather to Gentile believers. As he said, they are those who are not without the law of God, but under the law of Christ. You see, the Gentile believers did obey the Torah as interpreted by the Messiah and communicated through the apostles. Paul freely associated with Gentile believers so that he might strengthen and encourage them and hopefully entice more Gentiles to become believers. In verse 22, Paul said that to the weak he became weak. The weak are, again, Gentile believers. Both phrases, those who are without law and weak, were likely used not by Paul, but by those in the larger Jewish community to describe Gentile believers. The implication is that Paul, as a Torah-observant Jew, certainly did not need to associate with Gentile believers, and in fact, he likely only incurred persecution from the larger Jewish community for doing so. But his purpose was to give up that freedom and to associate with them, to help them, and to win them over to the gospel. Paul concludes in verse 22 that he became all things to all men so that he might by all means save some. Paul is not saying that he lived according to different standards depending on who was around. But instead, he did not neglect to associate with any group because his goal was to reach all people, even if that meant giving up his freedoms. As Paul said in verse 23, I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. However, all things here does not refer to being a hypocrite or to breaking the Torah, something that would actually disqualify him from being a teacher sent from God. Instead, Paul is referring to service, placing others as more important than himself. For more videos, click on the subscribe link below or visit youtube.com/messianicniagara and you can click on the subscribe link there. Like us on Facebook, facebook.com/messianicniagara. You can follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/messianicniag. Email me at contact@messianicniagara.com. And as always, please visit our website, messianicniagara.com. If you've been enjoying these videos and you would like to support me, please consider clicking on the donate link on messianicniagara.com. If you enjoy these videos on a regular basis, please consider setting up a monthly donation. head on over to messianicniagara.com, and there you can follow the instructions to set up a monthly donation. By sending a monthly donation, you are helping to ensure that I can begin to do this on a full-time basis. Those of you who have donated, thanks so much for your support. And at the very least, please share these videos with others. Thanks for watching.